You know, in 38 years on this bench, I have seen arrogance walk through my courtroom door in every shape and size imaginable. I have seen men in $1,000 suits who thought a well-tailored jacket was a substitute for common decency. I have seen business owners who believed that success excused them from the basic requirement of treating other human beings with respect. But on a bright Thursday morning in October, I encountered something that stopped me cold in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. A young woman walked into my courtroom carrying herself like the world owed her an apology, and within minutes, she did something so breathtaking in its disrespect that every single person in that room fell completely silent, and then 5 minutes later, she learned a lesson that no amount of money could have purchased for her. I want to tell you this story exactly as it happened, every detail, because what unfolded in my courtroom that morning was about far more than a traffic ticket. It was about what happens when entitlement finally meets its limit. It was about a young woman standing at a crossroads she didn't even know she was approaching, and it was about the strange, unexpected mercy that can sometimes come from the hardest moments. But before I get into it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story, I promise you, is one you are going to want to hear from beginning to end. Don't go anywhere. My name is Judge Carol Whitmore. I have presided over municipal court in Hartford, Connecticut since 1986. Before that, I spent 12 years as a public defender, which means I have seen this system from just about every angle there is. I have represented people who had nothing. I have sat across from prosecutors who had all the power, and when I finally put on the robe, I promised myself I would never forget what it felt like to be on the other side of that bench. I wake up at 5:45 every morning. My husband, Gerald, makes the coffee because he knows I am useless before caffeine, and he has known this for 41 years of marriage. I take 20 minutes to read on the back porch, whatever book I'm working through at the time. It's a ritual that centers me, because when you're about to spend a day holding people accountable, you need to be centered. You need to be clear. Justice cannot come from a clouded or agitated place. My courtroom is not fancy. It's a working courtroom, dark wood benches, fluorescent lighting, an American flag that needs replacing. My clerk, Marcus, has been with me for 19 years, and he knows my preferences better than I know them myself. He knows I like my cases organized by complexity, not by time. He knows I give people more latitude when they tell the truth than when they try to spin me. And he knows that the one thing I will not tolerate, the one thing that has never changed in 4 decades behind this bench, is disrespect. Not disrespect toward me necessarily. I can handle that. Disrespect toward the institution, toward the process, toward the other human beings in that room who are there for the same reason. Because something went wrong and they need it sorted out fairly. That Thursday morning, Marcus had given me a look when I came in. Not the look that means we have a tragic case. The other look, the one that means we have a difficult personality on the docket. I have learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. I asked him about it, and he said simply, "Number 7, Judge, you'll see." I made a note of it and put on my robe. The first 6 cases that morning were routine: a parking dispute between a landlord and a tenant, a speeding citation for a young man who had a genuine emergency and could prove it, a noise ordinance violation that turned into a surprisingly heartfelt conversation about grief and loneliness. That happens sometimes. People come in about one thing and it turns out to be about something else entirely. My job, I have always believed, is to see the whole person, not just the case file. Then Marcus called case number 7. The name on the docket was Brianna Hargrove. I looked up when she walked in, and I want to be honest with you about my first impression because it matters to the story. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they have never really struggled, when life has smoothed all the rough edges away. She wore clothes that I recognized were expensive even from a distance. Her hair was perfect. Her posture said clearly that she was not accustomed to being in rooms like this one. She looked around my courtroom the way someone looks at a waiting room they feel is beneath them. She didn't walk to the front. She sauntered. There's a difference. She stood before my bench and looked up at me without any of the deference that people usually carry into this room. Most people, when they stand before a judge, even if they're innocent, even if they're confident, They carry a certain awareness that something important is happening, that gravity is present. Brianna Hargrove did not appear to be carrying any awareness of that kind. I looked down at the citation. It was a red light violation at the intersection of Farmington and Prospect, issued 3 weeks prior. The fine was $230. I looked back up at her and I said, "Ms. Hargrove, you've been cited for running a red light on October 3rd at approximately 8:22 in the morning. How do you plead?" She tilted her head slightly, like the question was mildly irritating. Then she said, "My father is Richard Hargrove." I waited a moment. I said, "I heard you. How do you plead?" She blinked. I could see she wasn't accustomed to that response. The name Richard Hargrove was meant to do something in this courtroom, meant to shift the atmosphere. Richard Hargrove was one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the state of Connecticut. He had his name on buildings and a wing of the hospital and a scholarship fund at the university. His name was, in certain circles, a kind of currency. It was not currency in my courtroom. She said, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'd like this dismissed." I said, "On what grounds?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I can only describe as confused impatience, like a person who has pushed a button many times and cannot understand why the elevator isn't responding. She said, "Because I'm telling you it was a mistake." I said, "Ma'am, do you have any evidence to present? A dash cam recording, a witness, any documentation that contradicts the officer's citation?" She said, "I don't need documentation. My father will—" And that's when it happened. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the citation, the physical paper citation, and she slapped it down on the edge of my bench. Not set it down, not placed it, slapped it, and then, in a motion that I am still not entirely sure was deliberate or simply the product of someone who had never once considered consequences, she flicked it with 2 fingers. She flicked it off my bench and it fluttered down to the floor between us. The courtroom went absolutely silent. I mean that, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when 20 people collectively hold their breath. I looked at the citation on the floor. I looked back up at Brianna Hargrove. She was standing there with an expression that I think was meant to communicate indifference, but underneath it, I could see something flickering, the first small ember of the realization that she may have made a mistake. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that. I have never found that raising my voice serves justice. What serves justice is clarity, precision, the calm delivery of an unavoidable truth. I said, "Ms. Hargrove, pick that up." She stared at me. I said again quietly, "Pick that up." For a moment, I genuinely did not know what she was going to do. The room was so still I could hear the clock above the door. Then slowly, Brianna Hargrove bent down and picked up the citation. I said, "You will place it on the corner of my bench with both hands. You will do it now." She did. I said, "Thank you. Now, here is what is going to happen next, and I want you to listen very carefully because I am going to say this once. What you just did in this courtroom constitutes contempt. Demonstrating disrespect for this court is a matter I take with the utmost seriousness. I could hold you in contempt right now. I could have you removed from this room and give you time to think about your choices. I could add to your situation significantly." I paused. "But I'm not going to do that. Not yet. Because first, I want to hear from you, not about your father, not about his name or his money or his buildings. I want to hear from you. Who are you, Brianna Hargrove? Not whose daughter are you. Who are you?" She stared at me, and something cracked just slightly in that composed expression. Now, let me pause here for just a moment because I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone finally called you on something you didn't even know you were doing? Where someone held up a mirror and you saw something in yourself that you weren't ready to see? Leave me a comment because I genuinely want to know. And if this story is getting to you the way it got to everyone in my courtroom that morning, hit that like button for me. What happened next is the part of this story I think about most. Brianna Hargrove stood there in front of my bench, and for a long moment she said nothing. I watched the architecture of her composure shift. It didn't collapse, it just changed. Something moved behind her eyes, and then she said something I was not expecting. She said, "I don't know." Quietly, just those 3 words, "I don't know." I leaned forward. I said, "Tell me about the morning of October 3rd, not about the light, about the morning. She looked at her hands. Then she looked back up at me and she said, I was late. I'm always late. I was supposed to be at a meeting that my father arranged for me, a job. He set it up. I didn't ask him to, but he did. And then he told everyone I was coming and I couldn't disappoint him again. I said, again? She said, I've been disappointing him for a while. The room had changed. The 20 people on those benches who had watched this young woman flick a piece of paper at a judge were now watching something different. They were watching the moment when a person stops performing and starts being real. I said, how long have you been living the life your father designed for you? She exhaled, a long, shaky breath. She said, my whole life, I think. I said, and how's that working out? She looked at me and something that might have been a broken laugh came out of her. She said, clearly not great. I ran a red light and threw a piece of paper at a federal judge. I said, municipal, but yes. And then something happened that I have turned over in my mind many times since. She said, I'm sorry, not just for the paper, for all of it. I walked in here like the rules weren't for me. And I've been walking around like that for a long time and I didn't even see it. I sat back. I let the courtroom breathe. Now look, I want to be clear with you. I am a judge. I am not a therapist. It is not my job to excavate the psychological history of every person who appears before me. But I have been behind this bench for 38 years, and I have learned that the case in front of me is almost never really about what it says on the paper. The paper is the door. The real room is behind it. What I saw standing before me was not a villain. What I saw was a young woman who had been handed everything except the one thing that actually matters, a sense of herself that wasn't borrowed from someone else's expectations. She had been Richard Hargrove's daughter so completely and for so long that Brianna Hargrove, whoever that actually was, had never been given the space to exist. That is not an excuse for what she did. Let me be clear about that. What she did was wrong. Disrespect for this court, for this process, for the people who work within it, none of that is acceptable regardless of the reason. And I was not going to simply wave it away with a warm speech and send her home. But justice is not the same thing as punishment. I have believed that since I was a public defender sitting across from prosecutors who confuse the two. Punishment simply inflicts pain. Justice attempts to correct a course, and sometimes in order to correct a course, you have to first make sure the person understands exactly where they are and exactly how they got there. I said, Ms. Hargrove, here is what I am going to do. The citation stands. You ran that red light. You will pay the $230 fine. Additionally, for contempt of this court, I am assigning you 40 hours of community service to be completed within 60 days. Not a donation in your father's name, not a check written by someone else. You, personally, 40 hours. You will work those hours at the Hartford Community Kitchen, where they serve approximately 400 meals every day to people who have nothing. You will report to the director. You will do the work that needs to be done, and you will return to this court in 60 days with a signed verification. She nodded slowly. I said, but I want to say something else to you, and I want you to hear it clearly. I am not doing this to punish you. I am doing this because I think you need to stand next to people who are surviving on nothing, people who did not have a Richard Hargrove to open doors for them, people who get up every day and fight for something as basic as a meal. And I think that experience might introduce you to something you haven't met yet. She said, what's that? I said, yourself. She stood there for a moment, then she nodded again. And this time it was a different kind of nod, not the nod of someone performing compliance, the nod of someone who has just understood something. I brought the gavel down, case closed. Now let me pause here again because I need you to stay with me. What happened over the next 60 days and in the months after is the part of this story that I think matters most. So subscribe if you haven't yet and leave me a comment. Does this story resonate with you? Have you ever had a moment where someone redirected you before you went completely off course? I want to hear from you. I did not expect to be moved by what Brianna Hargrove reported back to me. Frankly, I expected compliance. I expected someone going through the motions, logging the hours, and walking back into her life unchanged. I have seen that many times. People serve their community service the way they pay a parking fine, reluctantly, minimally, and without allowing it to touch them. That is not what happened. When she returned to my courtroom 60 days later, she looked different. I don't mean physically, Though she did look different that way too. She was dressed more simply. She looked like someone who had been sleeping better and worrying about different things. But what I mean is that something had shifted in the way she held herself. The entitlement that had walked through my door 2 months earlier was not entirely gone. I don't think 40 hours of community service can undo 24 years of conditioning, but it had been loosened. There was more space around it now. She stood before my bench, and I asked her to tell me about the experience. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "There was a woman there named Dolores. She's 67 years old, and she lost her apartment 18 months ago when her landlord sold the building and she couldn't afford the new rent. She comes to the kitchen every single day, and she doesn't just take a meal, she helps. She sets tables, she talks to people who are alone, she knows everyone's name." Brianna paused. I asked her once why she helped when she was in the same situation as everyone else. And she said, "Because it's the only place I feel like I belong to something." I let that sit in the room for a moment. She said, "I have belonged to things my whole life, clubs, schools, boards. My father sits on every important board in this city. My name opens doors, and I have never once felt like I belonged to something." I said, "And now?" She said, "I went back after the 40 hours. I went back twice more. I'm going again on Saturday." I will admit to you that I had to take a breath at that point, not because I was surprised that community service could be transformative. I have seen it happen, though rarely, and usually with people who were already close to the edge of understanding something. I was moved because of the specificity of it, the name Dolores, the detail about setting tables. The quiet precision of her account told me she hadn't just been present for those 40 hours, she had been paying attention. And paying attention is the beginning of everything. I verified her hours with the director of the Hartford Community Kitchen. Not only had she completed them, but the director, a woman named Patricia, who has been running that kitchen for 22 years and has absolutely no patience for people who treat service as a performance, had written a note that I didn't expect. It said simply, "This one is going to be okay." I have kept that note. I looked at Brianna Hargrove and I said, "The court is satisfied. Your obligations are fulfilled." She thanked me, and then she said something that I wasn't expecting. She said, "Judge Whitmore, I owe you an apology that I should have given you 2 months ago. What I did in this courtroom, throwing that paper, it wasn't really about you. I was angry and scared, and I took it out on the closest thing that represented authority, but that doesn't make it right. You deserve better, and so did everyone in that room. I'm sorry." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Apology accepted. Now go do something with what you've learned." She nodded. She turned around. She walked back up that aisle. And I noticed something. The people in the gallery that day, different people than had been there 2 months ago, but people who had watched this exchange, they watched her go in a particular way, not with judgment, with something gentler than that. About 4 months after that court date, I was at a charity dinner for the Hartford Bar Association. I was seated at a table with several colleagues, and halfway through the evening, a woman approached me. I recognized her immediately, Patricia, the director of the Hartford Community Kitchen. She sat down beside me and said, "Judge Whitmore, I don't know if you're aware, but that young woman you sent to us, Hargrove, she has been remarkable." I asked her to tell me more. She said that Brianna had not only continued volunteering, but had used her connections, the connections that came from being Richard Hargrove's daughter, to do something genuinely useful with them for the first time. She had approached 3 of her father's business associates and secured donations that allowed the kitchen to expand its hours. She had organized a fundraiser, had done it herself without handing it off to an event planner, had invited people from both her world and from the world she had discovered at that kitchen. And she had stood up at that fundraiser and said, in front of everyone, that she had arrived at this cause because a judge had held her accountable and forced her to see something she'd been avoiding her entire life. She had said it publicly. She had said it with her father in the room. I asked Patricia how Richard Hargrove had responded to that. Patricia smiled and said, "He wrote the largest check of the evening, and afterward I heard him tell her he was proud of her. For the first time in his life, he told her he was proud of her for something she had actually done." I had to excuse myself from that table for a few minutes. Look, I need to ask you a favor now, and I mean it sincerely. If this story has done something for you, if it has reminded you that accountability doesn't have to be brutal to be real, that correction can come with compassion, that people can actually change when they're shown the right door instead of simply locked out, share this, please. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Send it to someone who is raising a young person and wondering how to teach them the difference between privilege and entitlement. Send it to someone who has been in a courtroom or who is afraid of one. Hit that like button and subscribe, because I have more stories from these 38 years, and I am not done telling them. I want to close by telling you what I believe after all this time. I believe that entitlement is not a character flaw. It is a learned behavior. It is what happens when someone grows up in an environment that consistently tells them that the rules apply to other people, that their name or their wealth or their connections form a different category of citizenship. It is, in a way, a kind of poverty, because it robs people of the ability to genuinely connect with other human beings on equal ground. And the people who suffer most from that poverty are often the people living inside it, who go through life with every door open and somehow still feel like they don't belong anywhere. What I tried to do for Brianna Hargrove, what I believe my job calls me to do in every case that walks through that door, is see the whole person, not just the citation, not just the contempt, not just the behavior that needs correcting, the whole person, because only when you see the whole person can you apply justice that actually means something. The $230 fine was about the red light. The 40 hours was about something larger. It was about introducing a young woman to a version of herself that had never been allowed to exist, a version that could set tables next to Dolores, a version that could raise money not because her father made a call, but because she had found something she actually believed in, a version that could stand up in a room full of people and tell the truth about where she came from without flinching. That version of Brianna Hargrove was always in there. She just needed someone to refuse to be bought or impressed or intimidated out of the way. That is what this bench is for, not for punishment, for justice. And justice, when it is done with wisdom and with care, does not just resolve a case, it changes a life. I have been doing this for 38 years, and on the days when I wonder if it still matters, when the docket is long and the cases are hard and the system feels like it is grinding people down instead of lifting them up, I think about a woman named Dolores setting tables at a community kitchen. I think about a young woman standing up at a fundraiser and telling the truth. I think about a father finally saying the words his daughter needed to hear, and I remember that this work matters. Every single day, it matters. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other. Show grace when you can. And remember, the rules exist for everyone. That's not a punishment. That's the foundation of a world where everyone belongs. God bless you.